Hello everyone, Hyper here. In this video, I will be teaching you how to play Unholy Death Knight in Battle for Azeroth's patch 8.0. This video will cover talent choices, stats, rotation, enchants, and gems. What it will not cover are Azerite pieces and trinkets, because these will be constantly changing throughout the first few weeks of the expansion, so they will have their own video when we get closer to the Uldir raid launch. The first thing we'll be taking a look at is what talent build you should be using. I will go over a single target and a dungeon and AoE build. In both of these, I will only talk about the damage increasing talents because I will talk about the utility talents on their own. For single target, we'll be going with Clawing Shadows. It is slightly below all will serve on perfect uptime, but since most bosses there is some movement involved, having a 30-yard range on one of your core rotational abilities makes up for it. Then we'll take Ebon Fever, Soul Reaper, and then you can choose between Pestilence or Defile. These two are essentially identical in damage, so you can play either one. Stats and Azerite traits might make your damage lean towards one rather than the other, but that will vary person to person. In the last tier, we will be taking Unholy Frenzy. Especially early in the expansion, when our secondary stats are still pretty low, this talent will smooth out our opener by quite a lot. For dungeons and AoE fights, I suggest going with Clawing Shadows. However, Infected Claws becomes slightly better if you have more than 8 or 9 targets. I still prefer using Clawing Shadows in most situations though, because of the range it provides. Then we'll take Bursting Swords, Soul Reaper, Epidemic, and Unholy Frenzy. If you're not exactly sure how these talents will change your rotation, don't worry about it. I will talk about this later in the video. For utility talents, they are purely situational. In row 58, Grip of the Dead is a great talent for dungeons, or if anything needs to be slowed and kited. If other people in your group already are running slowing AoE specs, so if you have a Frost Mage for example, then you're probably better off running one of the other talents. Death's Reach is a pretty solid talent for leveling, or in situations where there are several caster mobs that need to be gripped in, because as soon as you kill one of them, you're able to grip in the next one. I only use Asphyxiate in niche situations if my group is lacking stuns, but for most of the time I stick with Grip of the Dead. In row 75, Spell Eater is great for pretty much any situation with heavy magic damage. Several of the Uldir bosses and dungeons have debuffs where this talent comes in very handy. Wraithwalk is pretty much the same as before, and if you're in no danger of dying without one of the other two talents in this row, you should probably run this talent to make up for the lack of mobility we have. The third talent here is Death Pact, and this is an on-demand heal, but I usually don't like running it. I'm sure there will be scenarios where it will be useful, but this is a very niche talent, and especially if you're running solo content or stuff where you would have to heal the debuff off yourself, it's probably not really worth using. Next, moving on to stats. Before I even show you any priorities, I wanted to mention that these are just general guidelines, because stat priority will largely change depending on the number of targets you have and the gear and talent setup you're running. For single target, I like going with Critical Strike over Haste, which is equal to Mastery, over Versatility. Haste and Mastery can gain or lose value depending on the talents you take. For example, if you take All Will Serve rather than Clawing Shadows, then Haste will gain some value and Mastery will lose some value. But Critical Strike will remain the top stat and Versatility will remain the bottom one. For AoE, I stack as much Mastery as possible, because this stat interacts very well with all of our abilities that actually contribute to our AoE damage. And these are Festering Wounds, Bursting Swords, Epidemic, and Virulent Plague, because obviously these are our top AoE damaging abilities. After you've stacked as much Mastery as possible, you will want to go with Haste, which is equal to Crit. And again, these two will kind of shift values depending on the exact type of AoE you're doing. Because obviously there's just Cleave AoE, which is 2 or 3 targets, then there's larger AoE like 5 targets or 10 targets, and then there's also Insane Pools in dungeons where you will actually have more than 15 targets. And below all of these stats is Versatility. Just like for single target, Versatility will give you that passive damage boost on absolutely everything, and reduce the damage you take, but overall it is a very weak stat for Unholy DK, and I recommend avoiding it as much as you can. You probably noticed that I only talked about secondary stats. Obviously our main stat is strength, and in most situations strength will outvalue your secondary stats. This means that taking eye level upgrades, so for example a 10 eye level upgrade with maybe your middle 2 stats over a 10 item level lower item with your top 2 stats might be worth upgrading. But to get a very good idea of exactly what your stat priority is, I definitely suggest either downloading Simulation Craft and running your own sim, or just going to raid bots, which is extremely easy to do and it's obviously free, and you will get a very good idea on the stats you should be stacking. Now that your talents and your gear is set up properly, we can take a look at the rotation. First, let's talk about the opener, because this will be essentially the exact same every time you pull a boss. So you will Army of the Dead at -5 seconds on the pull timer. Then you will Dark Transformation at about 2 or 1.5. Then you will Outbreak at 0. As you're running in, you will cast Death and Decay or Defile if you're running either Pestilence or the Defile talents. Then you will Unholy Frenzy and Festering Strike once. And if this puts you at 4 or above wounds, then you will go ahead and cast Apocalypse. If it only puts you at 3, then you will want to Festering Strike again and quickly cast Apocalypse, not to overcap on wounds from Unholy Frenzy. After that, depending on if you had to Festering Strike once or twice, you will either Soul Reaper or cast another Festering Strike. This is because you only want to cast Soul Reaper when you have at least 5 of your runes on cooldown, so that means you have 1 or less available runes. After this, your rotation becomes a priority list. First, we have the maintenance dots and cooldown spells. So you want to maintain Virulent Plague on your target. Then you want to keep your Unholy Frenzy on cooldown, and like I mentioned before, you always want to cast Soul Reaper if it's available and you have at least 5 of your runes on cooldown. After that, you will want to cast your Apocalypse whenever you have at least 4 wounds on the target, and of course your Apocalypse is available. You will also want to keep your Dark Transformation and Death and Decay on cooldown. For our rotational abilities, you will want to Death Coil to spend your Sudden Doom procs, or to avoid capping Runic power. Then you will want to cast Festering Strikes if you have 2 or less wounds on your target. After that, you want to Clawing Shadows until you get to 1 or 0 wounds. And then lastly, you will want to Death Coil if all of your runes are recharging. For AoE, the rotation will be very similar with the addition of Epidemic instead of Death Coil. On 2 or more targets, you will want to Epidemic after your Death and Decay is over, or you are about to cap on Runic power. Only time you should cast Death Coil is if you have Sudden Doom procs and you are low on runes and Runic power. Next, moving on to Enchants and Gems. For our weapon, we are still going to be using Rune of the Fallen Crusader. On our ring, you can either use Pact of Critical Strike or Mastery. This will depend on the situation you're actually gearing for. For gems, you will want to use at least 1 Kraken's Eye of Strength, because this is a unique gem that you can only have 1 of in your gear. For the rest of your gems, you will either use Deadly Ember Blaze or Masterful Tidal Amethyst, depending on what type of damage you're actually gearing for. Since I am not giving you any information on Azerite pieces or trinkets, I will be leaving a website in the description box that keeps pretty updated sims on these topics. So if you want a vague idea of what is currently the best trinket or the best Azerite piece and Azerite trait, then you can go ahead and check that out. But keep in mind, these are just sims and these can change very quickly. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you'd like to gain access to my Discord, where you can interact with me directly and get updates on what is going on with my work, then make sure to check out my Patreon. If you enjoyed this video, then please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.